Hi, everybody. It's Bob Goff here. I'm sitting on my back porch, and I'm just so glad that we're going to get some time over the coming weeks to just talk about some stories, to talk about how we love one another. And we start with the people that are nearby, that are people that are in the blast radius of your love already. This series is called Everybody Always, and there's a book that goes along with it. But the most important thing I want you to know is that you're welcome here. There's something beautiful about just being welcomed. Plenty of us have been invited to things, right? Have you ever been invited somewhere you weren't welcome? There's a big difference. And so one of the things that I think that we can do in our lives is to let people know they're not just invited, they're actually welcome. And once people are welcome, they start sharing stories. And my hope is that we can just spend this next time together sharing a couple stories. And a win would be this, that after you're done watching this, you're sharing stories. Say, how has that happened to you? Where was a time that you saw somebody give away extravagant love? Who was your neighbor? We're going to talk first about a neighbor of mine. She's somebody that's taught me a tremendous amount about loving people. It was always a lawyer like me that tried to set up Jesus. Remember, he came up and said, "Tell me the big commandment." And Jesus said to love God with your heart and your soul and your mind. And he said, let me tell you another one, to love your neighbor like yourself. I learned a lot about loving your neighbor from a neighbor of mine who lived across the street. Sweet Marie and I had been married for a couple years, and we bought our first house. And I was so excited about this house of ours. We did everything. It was actually pretty nasty. We lived in the driveway in a motorhome for almost a year because there was a bunch of feral cats running around. It was just nasty. They were everywhere, and they were evidently afraid of mice because there was mice everywhere too. So we finally decided to take a step down in our lifestyle and move into the home we owned. And we tried to make this home ours. And over the course of a year or two, we just nailed it. It was beautiful. It was the house of Maria's dreams. Well, I was having breakfast with a friend, and I overheard the guy in the booth next to me talking to the person he was with about how he's going to sell his house. And it was right by my favorite surfing spot. The name of the surfing spot was Garbage. And so I slid into the booth next to him and said, "Man, I'm so sorry for eavesdropping, but it sounds like you're going to sell your house. I know your house. Is there any way you want to swap for mine?" And I did one of those George Banks things. I threw in the china. We literally traded houses over waffles. Well, I got home, I told Sweet Maria what a terrific deal I'd done. I blindfolded her, I drove her over to our house, and I took the blindfold off, and I was pointing at the house and back to my surf spot in the house, and she started crying. And she told me every marriage gets one of those. And I just used up 2 of those. Well, we stayed in that house for a couple years, and she fixed it up, and she did what she does to everything else in my life. She takes my garbage and makes it beautiful. But then when it was time to sell the house we had before, so we put a for sale sign in the lawn, and 5 people wanted to buy this thing. But we weren't looking for a buyer, we were looking for a neighbor. There's a big difference. You do business with buyers, you do life with your neighbors. And Carol came along. And Carol was a widow, and James in the book talks about widows and orphans and how we're supposed to treat them. So we gave her a big group hug, and we said, "Carol, you're our neighbor." And Carol moved in and lived there for the next 22 years. Carol became a famous family member, not just a family friend. As a matter of fact, our son and daughter-in-law got married in our backyard. And in the front row, there was a couple seats, and one was for Carol. When the kids were growing up, they used to run across the street to Carol's house. They'd tell her stories about how they would throw balls in the hall at each other, and they coined the phrase hall ball for this game they would play. They told her about how my other son got married to a life-size Barbie with my daughter officiating. They even told her about how my other son lost a frog in the living room. And every time when they tell Carol these stories, she'd put her hands over her mouth and act like it was the first time they told her, even though it was the 20th time. She'd ask him again, tell me about the frog that got away. And the whole time she would fill them with mountains of cookies. And we have a parade. We have this beautiful tradition on our block because we think this idea of loving your neighbors means you need to know them so that you can love them. So we started throwing a parade. We've had this parade for 22 years. It's been terrific. And Carol was the queen one year. You guys, it's great. When she goes to the grocery store, people bow to her and call her Your Majesty. It'll take her 45 minutes just to fill her tank up with gas. Everybody's interrupting her, saying, let me do that for you. It's really just beautiful. And I think there's something about loving our neighbors that was woven into the DNA. I know it's woven into our faith. It was so important that Jesus said, that's where we'd start, not where we'd end. Carol and I talk to each other. We've been talking to each other on the cell phones for 20 years. And I just don't want her to be alone. And I think that's probably why God made so many people on earth, so nobody would have to be lonely for very long. And one day I called Carol and she said she just got back from the doctor and she'd gotten some bad news. The doctor said, Carol, you have cancer. And so I rushed over to her house, but I stopped at Radio Shack first and I got us 2 walkie-talkies. And I put the walkie-talkie in her bedroom. I put the other walkie-talkie in ours. And for the next couple of years, Carol and I started talking to each other on the walkie-talkie. There's something beautiful. It's kind of like stringing 2 peach cans together. Because when you're on a walkie-talkies, you're 9 years old. You're up in tree forts. Nobody's got cancer. The first time I called her up, I said, hello, Carol? You got to make the sound. She said, Bob, is that you? I'm like, who else would it be? And for the next couple of years, Carol and I only talked on the walkie-talkies. And you know what? These walkie-talkies didn't fix her cancer, but she wasn't afraid anymore. I think that's God's message to us. It's always been his message to us. He said it to Joshua. He said, you're taking over for Moses. And Joshua said, I can't do that. He said, Joshua, be not afraid. God said it to Abram before this big battle. He said, I'm your shield and your great reward. Be not afraid. Jesus said it to 4 dudes in a rowboat, and he came walking out on the water and he said, it is I. Be not afraid. I think he knew that if we weren't afraid, then nobody would be afraid. It would spread like a cold. This is the best kind of cold in the world. That we would see what he's doing in our lives, in the lives of the people he's surrounded us, and we'd get another peek at what he might be doing in the world. And we start with our neighbors. Well, Carol took a turn, and we ended up visiting her in the hospital after this operation, and I brought the walkie-talkie with me. And I gave it to the nurse and had her bring it to Carol. And I slipped into the bed in the other side of the room. And I had a walkie-talkie. And I turned it on after saying a prayer that God would allow Carol to just stay with us for a little bit longer. And when I turned it on, I said, hello, Carol? And you could hear a little fumbling around in the bed next door. And Carol said in a really weak voice, Bob, is that you? And I said, oh, Carol, it is. And we just cried and cried together. When my kids were really young, when they had trouble sleeping, what I'd do is I'd rub their nose, like right here. And Carol and I talked about her life, and we talked about Jesus and a life together, and I'd rub her nose until she would fall asleep. Carol had these really unique appetite, like things that would sweep over her. And she decided she wanted this particular kind of hot dog. And I think they must only make 4 or 5 a year, because I drove around to every single deli in San Diego trying to find one. I finally found the hot dogs. I wanted to spike it in the aisle. I was like, yes, it was like finding Jimmy Hoffa. And I rushed home, I showed her the hot dog, and she said, I want to see the package. She knows I'm a lawyer and I might go Oscar Mayer on her. That's what neighbors do. That's what we were meant to do. We were meant to find our joy, and part of our joy is helping other people find theirs. We brought Carol home to be among her friends and family for the last days that she'd spend with us here on Earth. And I asked Carol, do you have kind of a bucket list thing, something you always wanted to do that you've just never gotten around to doing before? And she said, you know what? I've always wanted to toilet paper someone's house. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Well, the next day she called me at 4 p.m. and she's like, let's go. I'm like, girl, you usually go at midnight, but whatever. So we went across the street and we started throwing toilet paper over the neighbor's tree. And she had this thing. She's got quite an arm too. And just as we were getting the last roll over the top, the cops showed up. They turned on their lights. They said, this is a misdemeanor. I'm like, buddy, I have diplomatic immunity. She's dead in a week. Sue me. Well, that's what happens. You guys, you just want to find that childlike faith. Jesus spent a ton of time with his friends talking about that. 2 of his friends actually were arguing about who'd get the big chair next to him in heaven. And he said, I'll tell you the truth, unless you change and become like a child, you'll never enter the kingdom of God. I was raised, you just say a prayer. Evidently, there's more. It's a childlike faith. Not childish, guys, we've got that nailed, but a childlike faith. Think of that playfulness. Think of the younger version of you. What do you do when you lose the keys to your car? You go back and you say, where was the last place I saw them? Think to yourself, where was the last place I saw my joy? Where was the last place that I felt like this idea of curiosity, what was happening around me, who lived around me, who were my neighbors? We had one last New Year's Day parade, and my prayer was that Carol would make it long enough to see one last parade. And she was too weak to make it outside that day, and so we picked her up and we put her in the front window of her home. What Carol didn't know is we changed the parade route, and all 700 of us walked right through her front yard. And Carol sat in her chair, blowing kisses goodbye to her friends. And kids put their noses up against the windows and bounced balloons. And that next week, Carol went home to heaven. It would have been her second parade of the week. And you know what Carol taught me? She taught me the value of knowing your neighbors, and not just knowing about them or just waving to them, but diving into their lives. And because we did a cannonball into Carol's life, she did a cannonball into ours. And she taught us more about our faith. She taught us more about these beautiful ideas that Jesus shared with a lawyer: to love God with your heart, your soul, and your mind, and love your neighbor like yourself. Here's the deal, you guys. Like, we want to love everybody on earth. Like this idea that God so loved the whole world. But what we need to do is start across the street. Find these people that God's already put in proximity to you, and then you be present with them. And I know it can be awkward. God makes us in every different flavor. But what he made for us is to understand more about him by understanding more about the neighbors that he put around us. And if we keep avoiding people, we'll never meet our neighbors, and we'll miss out on some of what God has. I meet people that don't want to be around other people. And I'm like, oh, you're going to hate heaven. Everybody, always, right? So start with your neighbors. Here's just a practical thing. You've got a neighborhood full of people. Go and meet people. Literally bring them a candy cane. Don't wait for Christmas. Like, drop them a note and say, you know, I'm just grateful to be your neighbor. Find some way to connect. I've got a neighbor that for a dozen years took my garbage out every single Monday morning. And he put it back. He's running this huge corporation, but he spent every single week taking my garbage out and putting it away. You know why? He knew what it meant to love your neighbor, and I think you do too. You're probably amongst a group of them now. You might be in different neighborhoods, but God sees this earth as one big neighborhood. So you don't have to, again, go across an ocean. My hope is that what you'll do is you'll listen to these things and then tell stories amongst yourselves about your neighbors and how you've engaged them. And you can't love them if you don't know them. So what's a big step for you? Who are you going to get to know? What's your next courageous move? And I'll tell you, it might be just next door, to this side, to that side, or across the street. Find them, and I tell you what, you'll find a little bit more about your faith. You'll find out more about who God is. You'll know more about who you are. And you know what else you'll know? You'll know who your neighbors are. Go across the street, find somebody, and take the next courageous step for you. And we aren't going to compare leaps because God doesn't do that. He isn't interested in what you do compared to what I do and the next person. But what he did is he planted these beautiful people around you. I hope you'll go and meet them because you'll find out more about who he is. You'll find out more about who you are when you find out more about who your neighbors are. All right, you guys, so long.